Thank you so much for hosting me today. I'm always really glad to have an opportunity to deliver this topic, even though we need many more hours to really cover the topic. But I'll point you all to resources so you can continue your learning. I've got a slide at the end of the presentation. So our department is about food, nutrition, health, healthy lifestyles, food safety, and food preservation. So I have a great interest in safe home food preservation, and I'm really hoping to kind of compete with the bloggers and other unsafe sources of information on home food preservation. So today, what I have planned is really an overview of canning in glass jars, and it really is intended for beginners. So hopefully some of you are wanting to be first timers, and you'll get some information to get started. So before we begin, a little bit about food safety in general. Remember, every step of handling food, we need to think about safe handling. So just remember the rules apply whenever you're handling food. Clean, separate, cook, and chill. Keep everything clean. Make sure you don't cross-contaminate uncooked foods with foods that could be sources of bacteria. Cook and store at proper temperatures, and handle properly, especially in hot weather when we have food outside of refrigeration. So every step of food handling is important for safety. And when we're talking about garden produce, which really we'll be talking about here, we need to especially be thoughtful about handling produce safely. So once again, when we're preparing to do a canning day, for example, make sure everything is clean. Surfaces in your kitchen are clean. You'll be washing all your produce thoroughly under running water. Some produce, like hard-shelled, hard-skinned produce, like melons or cucumbers, you can use a produce brush, sort of like a soft bristled brush. Currently, it's not recommended to use commercial products to clean produce. Running them under water and using your hands to make sure dirt is removed, that's sufficient. Be careful what you dry them with. Paper towels are the best that you can dispose of, or clean towels. Be careful of towels that have been hanging in your kitchen, for days and days, and might have been contaminated with bacteria from other sources. Once again, be careful not to cross-contaminate cutting boards and things that you're using for produce with cutting boards that may have been used for meats, raw meats, poultry, or fish. And be careful when you're storing your produce. Some produce needs to be stored in a refrigerator for best keeping, and some can be stored, at least for short periods of time, on the counter if they're ripening. So I always say, look how it's stored in the supermarket. That'll give you an idea of how you should store it at home. Okay. So the basics of safe home canning. So this is a homesteading group. So I'm sure everybody in this group is interested in sustainability, maybe using garden produce that you are producing at home on your homestead. I mean, that's fantastic. But even if you're not, maybe you're hooked up with a farmer's market and you're getting great supplies of in-season produce. So when we're talking about preparing for canning on a regular basis, in the long term, you might save money on your grocery bills, especially if you're growing your produce at home. Usually there's some initial investment. My husband likes to tease me and say my tomatoes cost about $25 a pound by the time I'm done with buying support systems, stakes, fertilizers, whatever. But there was always an initial investment in purchasing supplies you'll need for canning. Again, you may be very interested in supporting a sustainable lifestyle. In Hunterdon County, that's a very big interest. I have a lot of consumers that are interested in that. My area as a dietitian, I think growing your own food and preserving your own food is a great way to really manage what goes in your food. So from a nutritional perspective, and it really can be fun and very rewarding. You may have other reasons why you're interested, but these are some of the popular reasons. When it comes to nutrition, dietitians like to say all forms count. What matters is that you're eating your fruits and vegetables and your produce, healthy foods in general. So canned fruits and vegetables are a great substitute for fresh when we can't get fresh. Now, we're pretty lucky in New Jersey that we can get fresh produce all year round for the most part. It's not always as great as in season, but you know, we're very fortunate that we have an ample supply. When we can, because canning is a heat process, some nutrients, such as water-soluble nutrients, may be lost during the heating process. On the other hand, so like, for example, vitamin C is very heat labile, some of the B vitamins. In canning, the tested recipes are always tested for not just safety, but also quality of product. And usually the tested recipes aim to have the shortest processing time that is the safest, so that the quality of the food is preserved. And also the shorter that you're subjecting the food to heat, the fewer of these nutrients that might be lost. Some nutrients, however, are magnified or better absorbed after heating. So I think probably the most popular one that we read about in nutrition would be lycopene in canned or heated tomato products. So that becomes more available to absorption and digestion. And some heat processed foods are just a little bit easier to digest because the fiber is softened a bit. So canning can modify the nutritional content, but overall, if it's increasing your intake, that's what's really important, is that you're getting more servings of fruits and vegetables. There are canning recipes, safe canning recipes that can be canned with little or no salt, depending on what we're talking about, or little or no sugar for some jams and things like that. So again, if you're working with a tested recipe, which I will talk about, you do have some flexibility in controlling salt and sugar. Okay, so what exactly are we talking about when we're talking about canning? So here, this is a little rundown of the overall process, and then we'll go kind of step by step. So we want to start with high quality food. So the best quality, the quality that's going in will equal the quality that's coming out in your final product. So canning is not a process where we want to use overripe foods or bruised fruits and vegetables, sub-quality. We really want to start with peak quality. And we're going to be following tested recipes. I could talk for an hour just about that topic, but what we mean by that is a recipe that has been tested to guarantee that if you follow certain steps, there will be minimal risk for bacterial contamination. And as I said before, the highest quality product that we can get in a home canning process. And this is actually a good point to bring out now. Commercial canning is a whole different ball of wax. There are, different methods and processes that are available for commercial canning. That's not really what we're talking about at home. We're talking about specific methods that have been developed for home canners that, again, guarantee minimal risk and the best quality that can be obtained in a home canning situation. So what are we doing? We're placing food. Some of it has been pre-prepared. We're placing that food into a glass canning or mason type jar with a 2-piece lid, which I did bring. So this is what we're talking about, 2-piece lid system, the lid and the ring band. And then we're going to be heating those jars. The temperature range that we need to reach is 212 degrees to 240 degrees Fahrenheit. 212 is what boiling water can reach, but 240 is what pressure canning can reach. So I'm going to be describing why we need to use pressure canning in some situations. So those are the temperatures that we have to reach in order to destroy harmful microorganisms. And while we're doing that, we're also inactivating enzymes. So enzymes are those proteins that are in fruits and vegetables, in all foods, that can cause, that are actually cause ripening. Those are what are responsible for ripening in fruits and vegetables, or degrading, after we've reached a, peak for the fruit or vegetable. But we don't want those continuing to work in our jars of canned foods. So heating will inactivate them so that they can't change the color or the flavor or the texture of foods any longer, or it'll be minimal change. And finally, we're driving as much air out of those jars during the heating process, so that what we end up with is a vacuum seal. So here I have a jar of, kind of hard for me to say, a jar of jam that actually my pear butter from my pear tree. And I have a really good vacuum seal on there. That is what we want to achieve. Okay, let's keep going. So the vacuum seal. So it holds that lid on very, very, very tightly, completely. And so it prevents anything coming from the outside getting back into that jar. And if we've done a good job of driving all the air out of the jar, it'll also prevent the top of the food in the jar from drying out and changing color. So the vacuum seal is really important. And when the jars don't seal, then we either have to reprocess them or put them in the fridge and consume them quickly. But hopefully, after a batch, if you're practicing with canning, most, if not all, of your jars will seal. I'll show you how to tell if they will. So how do we know which of the, how do I know which method? Do I have to memorize it, or where do I go to find this information? So it's based on science, it's based on food safety, and that's what we like to talk about a lot in extension education of home food preservation. We focus on the science and the reasons why we do things, and that way it becomes easy to know what to do rather than relying on misinformation. So basically, in home canning, we're going to divide foods into 2 main categories. We had the first category are our acidic foods. And they have a low pH. Remember your pH scale from high school chemistry. 7 was neutral in the middle, and on the low end, the 1 to 7 were the acidic side of the scale, and then 7 to 14 was the basic side of the scale, or the non-acidic. So the acid foods are the low pH foods, and then the opposite of those would be the neutral or high pH foods. And in canning, we call those low acid foods. So high acid foods, low acid foods. And this is going to determine which method we use. So what's in the acidic foods group? Well, here's where we put basically all fruits. Tomatoes go here, figs, Asian pears, but they're borderline. These are considered borderline acidic, and we have to add an extra acidification step for them. And we do that by adding right into the jars when we're canning, either citric acid. I brought some citric acid. You can get that in the Walmart or in Tractor Supply or wherever you buy your canning supplies. or bottled lemon juice. Bottled lemon juice, not squeezed from a lemon, because we have standard acidity in bottled lemon juice. Okay. Other foods that fall into the acid group would be fermented foods. So, for example, when we ferment foods, we select microorganisms that will actually produce their own acids. So a good example of that is sauerkraut. And then pickles would be another group, because we're actually adding acid to pickles. So that would be vinegar that we add to pickles. So fruits, fermented foods, and pickles would fall in the acidic foods group. Now the opposite, the low acid foods, that's where all other vegetables would fall. So green beans, cabbage, whatever other vegetables that are in your garden, carrots, beets, meats, poultry, seafood, soups, and mixtures. So if we're making a spaghetti sauce where we have tomatoes, but we're adding meat, or we're adding other vegetables, we've created a mixture. And all of these foods on this page, on this slide, would be then considered low acid foods, and we would have to use a different processing type for this group. So I just said most of this about tomatoes. This is something you don't want to guess. I get people asking me, can I use pH paper at home? If a variety is considered a low acid or a high acid tomato, can I go by that? No, we're considering all tomatoes as fruits, essentially, that need to have that extra acidification step. And when you look at a tested method, either in your Ball, Blue Book, or in your USDA methods, they will tell you exactly how much bottled lemon juice or citric acid to add to your jars. So my main point of this slide is, don't be using pH paper in your kitchens, and don't be judging tomatoes by variety. All tomatoes are lumped into the category that they're considered acidic, but borderline, and they need an extra acidification step in home canning. Okay, so getting back to the methods. For those acidic foods, the fruits, the tomatoes, the pickles, and the fermented foods, we can use boiling water method, boiling water bath method. So we have a big pot. Remember, we said water can boil at 212 degrees at sea level. And we'll talk about higher altitudes in a second. So this is the method that is the method of choice for all the acidic foods. If we're talking about the list of foods on the non-acidic group, the vegetables, the mixtures, the meats, all of those, the soups, all of those, we must use pressure canning, because we need to go that extra mile and have our process reach 240 degrees Fahrenheit. And I'm going to explain to you why we need to reach that extra temperature step. And this is the reason. Because the acidic foods are generally not as hospitable to microorganisms. Those higher pH foods, like the vegetables, are more attractive to microorganisms. They can grow better in a higher pH. And we're particularly concerned about this one, Clostridium botulinum. I'm sure most of you have heard about it. This is the microorganism whose spores and toxins can cause botulism. So the issue with this microorganism is really the spores. So those are the reproductive bodies of this microorganism. They like low oxygen conditions and low acid conditions to grow, and room temperature. And that's exactly what we have in a jar of, here I have green beans that have been pressure canned. So the environment in this jar would be very attractive for any of these microorganisms that might still have survived to make it into that jar. However, we can kill them at temperatures at 240 degrees Fahrenheit or higher. So that's why we have to use pressure canning for that more risky group of foods, the low acid foods, because we are really trying to make sure that we're killing those Clostridium botulinum spores. Okay, I hope that's pretty clear. We don't even want to talk about botulism. This is not a thing you can taste. Please do not do that. Don't taste foods, your canned foods, if there's any suspicion that they have not been canned properly, because you cannot taste botulism. And even in this day, with all of these educational resources that we have, people still get sick from botulism, and many of the cases are due to improperly home canned foods. So this 2018, CDC will list botulism cases or outbreaks on some of their websites. So you can still find some information about reported outbreaks. So in New York City, there in 2018, there were improperly processed peas. So here the peas, vegetables should have been pressure canned, but they were water bath canned. And unfortunately, botulism spores obviously were not destroyed. There was this large outbreak in 2015. I know I saw this one in the paper with 1 death and 29 people who got sick. There was a church potluck in Ohio, and the suspect food were potatoes that were made into a potato salad, and the potatoes were improperly processed. So it does happen. It's still rare, but by knowing which method of processing you need to do, you can hopefully avoid any of these instances, because in almost all cases, there were errors in judgment in processing. Okay, so important musts. Food must be properly prepared and processed correctly. Where can you find reputable sources? Well, I have a great source right here. The National Center for Home Food Preservation is housed at the University of Georgia and is really the USDA's central location for consumer food preservation information. And we use that in Extension as our main source. However, most consumers don't know about that, but they do know about Ball. And the Ball Blue Book, even though we can't endorse Ball because we are a public agency, governmental agency, and Ball is a private company, but they've been around a very long time, and we actually have a very good partnership in Extension with Ball and share information. We have a couple of advisory groups and committees that are in existence. So we really work in partnership. We just can't outright endorse Ball, but frankly, consumers know about Ball, and I'd be very happy if they were using the Ball Blue Book as their source of recipes and information. Beware, we were chatting before the webinar started, beware of the just explosion of information on Facebook and other social media, blogs, sharing potentially unsafe information. And I take a lot of time to look at some of these sites. And unless the site states that they are following safe and tested recipes like USDA's National Center for Home Food Preservation or Ball, much of the information that is being shared is risky. Definitely risky. So please don't, if you are a beginner, please do not go to those sites. Go to one of these two. I think Ball's site is called Fresh Preserving. And, or I will talk about our resources also, our FCHS resources. the most important thing that you can do as a beginner is understand why you have to follow a tested recipe and follow a tested recipe. Please do not go to unsafe internet sites. Okay. So what does all this mean? Following the recipe exactly is probably the best advice I can give you. A tested recipe. Don't have the mentality of trying to change things up front. There's a reason why the recipe was developed the way it was. And that means everything from the jar size that is recommended, or if there's a recipe for a quart-sized jar versus a pint-sized jar. Sometimes there is only a recipe for one size jar. And if the other size jar is not there, it doesn't mean that you can take liberties and say, well, if it says 20 minutes for pint size, then I will add 10 more minutes and that should be safe for a quart. No, not necessarily. Because when recipes are tested, they're looking for the destruction of microorganisms in the center of the jar, in the most dense part of the jar. The worst case, that's one way of looking at it. So they're looking for the worst case situation, and then the recipe is developed to guarantee that that worst case does not happen. So you can't just willy-nilly substitute. So by adding extra sugar or even extra fresh herbs to a recipe. So if a recipe says add 1 sprig of dill, it's not safe to add a bunch of dill, because what we're doing is potentially changing the density. We're adding more basic or low acid foods. Okay, so that might change the processing time, or maybe that should have been pressure canned. Things that change the density, like extra sugar, flour, that's a no-no. Oils, that's a definite no-no. Thickeners, starches, all of those additions can change the density of the food in the jar. And therefore, what you're basically doing is making a recipe that has not been tested. So follow the directions of the tested recipe exactly. Save the extras for later. I say to people, if you want to have a specialty type of tomato sauce, for example, and you don't want to do it in a pressure canner as a mixture, make a basic tomato sauce and add your extras later when you open the jar. You have plenty of opportunity to be creative later than experimenting with what's in your jar beforehand. Okay, so some tips about the logistics of the canning day or time that you've set aside. So it's a long process. It's not something that you want to do, it can't be done in an hour, right when you have to pick up the kids in an hour, or you have to go to work, or you really need to dedicate a good block of time, depending on what you're making, because it's not just the processing time in the canner, but it's the before, it's the preparation, and then it's the processing itself. And if you're talking about a pressure canner, it's a cool down time. So it can be a big investment in time. And I would recommend, if you have a person, if it's your very first time, we'll talk about some good recipes to start with, like jams and jellies. Very short processing time. Maybe to have a friend come over, maybe a team, you can do it together. It'd be more fun. It's also easy to have somebody to clean up with you. But it is a big investment in time. Most people forget, I gotta be honest, the preparation of the product before it even goes in the jar can take longer, much longer than the actual processing time in the canner. So until you've actually run through a whole canning process, you won't have a good feel for how long it takes. So set aside a time when you will be dedicated to being in the kitchen. So first select your recipe. So again, if you only have a water bath canner, then don't be picking a pressure canner recipe or something that needs to be done by a pressure canner. And I would advise everybody as a beginner to start with water bath canning. Remember, those are the least risky foods. Those are generally quicker to process. It's easy, really easy to use a water bath. It's a pot with a lid. It's pretty easy. You bring it to a boil and keep it there. It's a little less daunting than a pressure canner. So pick your recipe, a tested recipe from either, let me show you this one. This is the actual, I would say, the cookbook of the the National Center for Home Food Preservation that we love this one. I kind of call it our Bible. It's produced by the University of Georgia Cooperative Extension, and it's available online. That's a great one. Or Ball, start with Ball. Ball has an excellent website with lots of recipes too. Pick your recipe, get all your stuff together. So this is an activity, this is a logistical activity. So you're going to have to get your canner, your jars, your lids, whatever you need to process your fruits or vegetables. So knives, or another pot if you're going to be making a jam or jelly, to stir down. An extra pot on the stove for hot water, cutting boards. So, you need a lot of stuff. Then you're going to prepare your product. So that's your washing, sorting, chopping. I'll talk about hot or cold pack in a second. So this is all preparation of our product. When we finally have that part done, then we're ready to fill our jars to the proper headspace. I'll show you a picture of that. And then really the easy part, I'm going to be completely honest, is when we've gotten to this part and we finally put those jars in the canner for the required processing time. And that varies greatly by what we're processing. So jams and jellies can be 5 minutes or 10 minutes. Pickles can be 15 minutes. Tomato sauce can be 35 or 40 minutes. And there's some, things in between, like fruits, 20 minutes. So it really depends. And where is this information coming? It's in your recipe. But this is the easy part when we've gotten to the actual processing. Then after whatever time our recipe says, we remove those jars from the canner gingerly. Then they have to sit in a place that's sort of where you're comfortable, room temperature, no drafts. They need to sit for 12 to 24 hours before we check that seal. So remember I showed you my jar of pear butter. So when I first take this jar out of the canner, I do not want to be touching it. I'm going to lift it out. Well, actually, I did bring let me show you this. See, if I was doing this in person, we would have an easy demo. But so I'm lifting it out of my canner with my jar lifter. I'm going to put it down on a towel or one of those nice soft racks, pads, and then it's going to sit there. So you need to have that space cleared off in your kitchen where these jars are going to sit. And then we're going to come back in 12 to 24 hours and check that seal, and it shouldn't move. And then we can finally take the ring band off and then label them and store them. So it's a logistical process, and good to be prepared, kind of run through it in your head the first time, have a friend there to help. Okay, a few words about raw pack versus hot pack that I used on the slide before. This is the pre-processing of your food. So you may see in your recipe book, like in my So Easy to Preserve, for, let's say I want to preserve tomatoes. So there might be a recipe for a raw pack and then a recipe for a hot pack. So a raw pack is when we're just not heating the food. And that would be, I don't mean processing, but I mean preheating. So that would be for a food that we don't want it to lose its shape. And we want sort of minimal heating. So pickles is a good example. We don't want to have cooked pickles. We want to minimize the amount of heat that we're applying to pickles. We want them to taste raw, but be processed correctly. Ditto with like those whole tomatoes. Once we heat tomatoes, they fall apart. They become a sauce. So if there's a recipe for a raw pack in whatever your source you're looking at, then that's what we mean by that. So we're basically placing the raw food directly into the jars, but we're covering it with a boiling hot liquid. That could be water, that could be some kind of a juice. Pouring it, and we're filling our jars with that liquid. We're going to make sure that we have the jar firmly packed so that we can have big floating pieces of food. And then we're going to put the lids on and put them in the canner. So the disadvantage with the raw pack is that you're going to get more air in the jar because we haven't cooked the food prior to putting it into the jars. So there's a good example of a raw pack of tomatoes. And you can see, there's a lot of liquid in the bottom of the jar. This is perfectly safe. You're not going to get as much food in the jar because we're starting with big bulky pieces of food. But that's a good picture of raw packing tomatoes. You just might want big pieces of tomatoes, so that would be an appropriate recipe. Now, a hot pack really is preferred for most foods. So there, in a hot pack, we're going to be heating the food prior to putting it into the jars, heating it in some kind of a liquid. Then we basically, so think of tomatoes now, a hot pack of tomatoes. So let's say we're making a sauce or some kind of crushed tomatoes. We're going to get a lot more tomato into the jar, and it's going to be more homogeneous, less air, so less floating. Fewer jars might be needed because we're actually getting more product into those jars. But the recipe will show you if you have a choice, it'll be spelled out in the tested recipe. And then it's up to you to decide, which one you want to pick. And there's a good picture. See, this is a hot pepper sauce. So it's very homogeneous. There's no big pieces of anything. It completely fills the jar, right? Completely fills the jar. We don't get a lot of airspace because we've reduced a lot of the air during the cooking and when we're filling the jar. So that's a good example of a hot pack. Headspace, I mentioned that. So headspace. So headspace is how much space we're leaving between the very bottom of the lid and the top of the food. So it's like, for example, in here, in this jar, it's very hard to see. I can't even see it. But in my jar of green beans, we use these. We were doing a class for master food preservers. So not all the headspace came out as high as we would have liked it. My headspace here after processing, it should have been about 1 inch. And here it actually fell a little bit more. But the headspace is from the amount space between the actual bottom of the lid and where the food comes, the level of the food. So ideally, now that is spelled out in the recipe. That's spelled out for the type of food. So from my slide here, jellies have a very small headspace of 1/4 inch. So my pear butter would be in that category. Fruits in general, tomatoes, pickles, it's a 1/2 inch. And then pressure canned foods, depending on the food, would be 1 inch to 1.25 inches. I think we were working with 1 inch on those green beans. So this one was we lost a little bit of headspace during processing. So you don't have to remember this. You will see this in your tested recipe. And why is it important? Oh, there's a great picture. So here you can see the very top rim. The lid would be right on top of that. 1/4 inch is about to that first line, 1/2 inch, and 1 inch. That's a really good picture, courtesy of Ball. Why is it important? So can I just sort of go willy-nilly? No. So too little headspace. So what that means is we're close to the lid, right? Well, what could happen if you have too little headspace? We can actually push that lid off in the pot. Food may bubble out and the lid can come off, or it won't seal because we won't have a good seal. We'll have deposits on the rim. So that's not good. So too much. So let's say we had an issue. We didn't remove a lot of the air out of that tomato jar. So what can happen with too much headspace? Well, we're going to get a layer of air in the jar, and the top of the food may discolor. That could happen. Or if it's really too much headspace, the jar may not seal because we're not going to get that vacuum that we needed. We left too much air. So headspace is important, and I'm going to be honest, that's a practice skill. In the beginning, I remember when I was first learning canning, I had a little ruler. We use it when we were judging at the fair. We have a little ruler, and we actually measure the headspace. So you can start with a little ruler or a little mark. Have a standard jar where you put a little mark, and you get really good at judging. Practice makes perfect. And that's what this is about. Okay. So finally, when we finally get to the part where we're talking about putting our jars in the canner, so we have that big pot, right? And it's going to have water. We're going to put water in it. We want to keep our jars, especially if we have we're planning to put hot food into the jars. So we want to have those jars hot in simmering water in that pot before we're ready to fill them. You can use your dishwasher to wash your jars, your lids. You just need to wash them in soapy water now. You don't have to boil them. They've changed the compound on lids now so that it's easier. You just have to wash them and dry them in thoroughly. I like to keep a box of washed and dried lids so they're ready to go. But your jars, you're going to put your jars in your canner beforehand and warm them up. If you're hot packing something, you can have them in simmering water. If you're raw packing something, just heat it enough to be hot. The issue we're trying to do here is when we're pouring the hot food into the jars, we don't want the jars to crack because of temperature differences. So we want the jars to be similar to the temperature of the food that's going in them. That's basically what we're trying to do here. So basically, you're going to have your jars in your canner. You're going to take them out, drain the water, put them on a towel on your counter, and then you're ready to fill them. So we're going to fill them to the proper headspace. Now, here's a really important step. The top of the jar, this rim, is where the lid, let me use this one because I have it. This is where the lid is going to fit on, okay? This part needs to be wiped clean with a damp paper towel right after we fill the jar because we don't want any food on there when we finally put this lid on. So make sure you have a piece of paper towel handy and you're going to wipe those rims. Then put your lids on. Then the question we get, you're going to put the ring band on fingertip tight. What does that mean? So I'm putting my ring band on. I'm not going to, I'm not doing that, just to the point that it is secure. Why? Because we want the air to come out of that jar in the processing. We want some of that air, a lot of that air to come out. If we have that ring band on too tight, we basically can't get the air out of the jar. So fingertip tight is what we tell people. Okay, so we're going to put our jars. The canners come with a rack. You have to have a rack in the bottom of your canner. We want the water flowing under the jars, and we don't want them sitting and possibly cracking on the bottom of your canner. Then we're going to make sure that this is water bath canning, that we're going to be filling up that canner. The water has to come 1 to 2 inches over the top of your jars. They're completely surrounded by water. And then we're going to turn up the heat until we get to the rolling boil stage. Now, when you're filling your canner, you may think you have enough water in there, and then you put your jars in, and it looks like, you know, the first time I would suggest you use a ruler to see how much do you have 1 to 2 inches of water over the tops of your jars? Okay, just to see, to calibrate your eye. You may need to add more water. You may have too much water in there. You need to take a little bit out so that it doesn't bubble out of your canner. So this is all skills you're going to learn. So we bring our canner up. It's boiling away. When it reaches a rolling boil, that's when we start our timing. And we time for whatever the process, the recipe says we should, whether it's 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 35 minutes, whatever. One thing I need to mention about altitude in New Jersey. The starting point for the recipes is under 1,000 feet. But there's a chart. If you happen to live in one of the few high points in New Jersey that's above 1,000 feet, and there are a few, like in Sussex, and I think Morris has got a few points, and maybe Warren, you're going to have to add some extra minutes to adjust for being at an altitude over 1,000 feet. So when you've reached your processing time, you turn off your canner. You're going to carefully remove the lid away from you so you don't get hot water in your face. And you add this 5-minute wait time that is built into the processing time. You need to wait that 5 minutes before you remove your jars. And then you take them out, put them on that spot that you have set aside where they're going to sit for 12 to 24 hours. Don't poke them. Don't go poking at the lids. Leave them there. Sometimes you'll hear that pop when the lids are sealing, but that's not the only indicator of a good seal. That doesn't mean that that's actually a complete seal. It's what's happening at 12 to 24 hours. That's the ultimate test. And then if your jars have sealed, you can take off the ring band after 12 to 24 hours and store your jars without the ring band. Make sure they're properly labeled with the date and the product. And you want to use them, I would say, between a year and 18 months. Some of the new ball lids say that they hold a seal, should be safe for 18 months. We haven't really adopted that with the extension methods yet, but the manufacturer, Ball is a reputable manufacturer, reputable lids. So here you go. Here's you'll see a chart like this in whatever resource. If you happen to be one of those few people, few spots in New Jersey that's over 1,000 feet, you can see we're going to add like 5 minutes of processing time. You don't need to memorize that. You just need to know what your altitude is if you're one of those few people. Okay, so just a quick pictures. I'm going to leave a few minutes of questions. Here's a picture of some of our tools. Classic water bath canner, the enamel pot with a rack, nice jar lifter, a funnel, that's essential. You need a funnel. Maybe another pot to have some of that extra hot water in case you need to add it if your level is dropping. Here's some pictures of the lids. People always ask me about one-piece lids, and we're going by what's recommended and tested currently. And two-piece lids are still recommended here in the United States and by USDA. Funnel, you'll avoid a big mess. You get a nice funnel. When you're filling your jars, straight up. Don't tilt them to try to get the water off. Straight up and gently place them on your prepared counter area. Also, when you're putting them into the canner, straight down. Leave enough space. Don't crowd your canner. Leave enough space. You want water to be flowing all around your jars. So don't try to, you'll find it's difficult to get them in and out. You want to leave some space for you to be able to lift them in and out. And checking your jar seals after 12 to 24 hours. You know that little pop? Let me see if I can hear. If you can hear that. So that's an unsealed lid. You should not, that should be no flexing after 12 to 24 hours. That little bump should be flat down. You can take your finger, move it along the lid. There should be no movement on your lid. That's the proper seal. Just one or two words about pressure canning. I know we're running out of time. Just want to show you the two types of pressure canners. Dial gauge versus a weighted gauge. So the dial gauge pressure canner, let me go to my picture. There. So the dial gauge on the left, the pressure is read by a dial. And then there's also a vent port where the steam is going to come out. We're going to have a 10-minute time where we're really flushing steam through. Then we're going to put a lid on that, put this little port on that, and then our canner will pressurize. So you might have a dial gauge canner, or this side is the weighted gauge canner. These are pressure canners. A couple of different types of gauges on the weighted gauge. Down here, it's like the one-piece type or the multiple-piece type. Basically, what we're doing with these, we're adding different weights depending on what weight we want to process at, whether it be 5, 10, or 15 pounds of pressure. The nice thing about a dial gauge is that it has sort of like infinite settings. Here we're limited to fixed pressures, but the gauge does need to be tested annually. And I do them in my office. We have someone in South Jersey who could potentially test them. I think it's Gloucester or Atlantic. If you are interested, if you have a canner that needs to have the gauge tested, you can mail. Well, if you're in Northern New Jersey, you can come to my office, make an appointment. But you're going to have to mail either the gauge, if you can safely get it off your canner, or the whole lid with it has to come in to be tested. It can be done either way. And I will make sure you guys have information about how to contact me. All right, I think that's all I'm going to say about pressure canning. The important thing about, other than the fact that the processing is the preparation, all of that is exactly the same. Follow your manufacturer's recommendations on your unit, because they will be specific to the particular unit that you are using. If you have a pressure canner, that's what I would advise. And if you have any questions about the use of it, refer to the manual. And start with water bath canning. If you're a real newbie, start with that and then progress. Once you've mastered the logistics and you've mastered all these other steps, then you can progress to pressure canning. Remember, those foods are a little bit riskier and just a little more advanced methods. 2 websites I want to leave you with. This website is where we have at least 8 webinars on different aspects, different types of foods and home food preservation that we did last year. And here's the website for the National Center for Home Food Preservation. And I think I said Ball was fresh preserving. That's the Ball website. So I'd be happy to try to take a few questions. I know it's a ton of information, but if you go to these recorded webinars, we have them broken down by pickles, tomatoes, jams and jellies, pressure canning, water bath canning, freezing, dehydrating. So each one is at least an hour. So I hope you have kind of an idea of what's involved in home canning, and most importantly, the reason why you need to follow tested recipes and avoid other sources of misinformation and unsafe information. Okay,
Great presentation, Sandra. I have
It's a lot of information and so much easier to do in an in-person setting, but we have the resources there. So, and we're always available to answer questions.
Yeah, I have a whole new respect for the amount of work and knowledge you need before you do it.
You know, not to be, it shouldn't be daunting, but, you need to be armed with the information, right? And to understand what really, the time that it's going to take. And the other thing too is think about what you're processing. I mean, my husband and I now we're the only two people in our house. Our kids are out. Who's going to eat what you're going to be processing? So think about what you're processing. Do you like it? Are you going to be you're going to be giving it away? Will you actually consume it? Is it worth the time? And there is, upfront costs. So think about what you're processing. Can you consume it within that 1 year time frame? Because, quality is not going to get better with age here. That's why these recommendations say a year to 18 months, because the jar may be safe, but the quality of the food will gradually deteriorate. You'll notice your headspace getting bigger and bigger. I've had people ask me, found something in their basement, could be 40 years old. Is it safe to eat? Why is my answer.
We do have a question about different types of food preservation.
Okay.
Amanda was wondering, aside from just saving space in the freezer, what
Yeah.
might be some comparisons between freezing versus canning?
Oh, excellent question. That's another consideration. Well, freezing, if you're going to do it in quantity, so if you have a big garden, you're going to need an additional freezer, a dedicated freezer. So I have 2 in my basement. So, you have the initial outlay of the cost and plus then the cost of electricity. But frankly, in some cases, freezing is easier because you can do small batches. So if you don't plant, let's say you only have like 1 row of green beans and you're not expecting buckets of green beans. So for canning, to make it efficient, you're going to need a large amount of food, because it seems like when you start canning, you say, I have this, giant amount of green beans. I'm going to get so many jars. Well, you don't end up with so many jars. Or maybe you think you're going to do so many batches, but you don't have the amount of food to justify so many batches. So freezing is great for small batches, because you can, as the produce comes in, you can freeze it. If you have a handful, if you have, whatever. So it's more flexible. You do need to have decent freezer bags and freezer containers. And, you do need to keep some kind of a reasonable logistics system of labeling, or you'll go out of your mind. And some vegetables do require blanching. So that's like a quick dip in boiling water to kill those enzymes we talked about. But I think for small families, where you might just have a small garden, freezing can be very efficient.
Excellent, thank you. There was one other question about I believe the question is about electric pressure canners.
Yeah. Well, according to, now, that's some of these devices that are available on the market, but are not necessarily tested by, let's say, the National Center for Home Food Preservation. They haven't been reviewed from their standards. So I don't know right now if they are approving, or they wouldn't approve, but they would, they would say it was safe, to use a particular model of electric pressure canner. I know that they do not recommend using pressure cookers or Instapots or anything like that. To be safe, I think I had, actually, if I can go back to one of my slides, I think I had a note on one of my pressure canning slides about Yes, this one. So USDA recommends for pressure canning that your canner must be big enough to hold at least 4 quart-sized jars. So some of these other devices that may be on the market may not be large enough to meet this requirement. And I also remember watching a presentation at one of our annual conferences about the testing of whether the pressure was consistent in some of these other devices, because in pressure canning, it is absolutely critical that the pressure be maintained over the time frame for the process. There can't be dips, there can't be variations. So I remember watching a presentation where they said that some of these devices were not maintaining that level of consistent pressure, which would make them less safe than a device, so a pressure canner that is meant just for canning. So I would say that that is still, there's lots of different devices coming on the market, but I would say that's still debatable whether they meet the standards of the National Center for Home Food Preservation. And the testing too. Some of these processes have been thoroughly tested by the National Center to guarantee that they meet that, remember that worst case scenario in the jar with the bacteria, with those spores. So I would say if you plan, I could look that one up and see if anybody has recommended any brand of electric pressure canner. But I would say if you plan to do serious pressure canning, then invest in a device that is, you know, really,
Specific.
yeah, really specific. Yeah.